You go into the woods to hunt deer, you don't expect to come out feeling hunted yourself. 3 times in the last 5 years, something happened to me or people I was with that stripped the easy part out of being outdoors. These aren't ghost stories. They're real, edged in the smell of cold metal, the grit of road dust, the twitch of a headlamp when something walks past your camp. I'm telling you 3 terrifying hunting encounters that actually happened to me or to people I was with. They left scars you can't stitch. If this kind of thing hooks you, stick around. Like and subscribe if you want more true accounts. I collect them, I share them, and I won't waste your time. I learned to hunt because of my dad. He wasn't preachy about it. He just loved the quiet and the deliberate work. He taught me how to pick a stand, how to field dress a deer without wasting meat, how to read a scrape in the dirt like you might read a page. He also taught me to respect private land, so when the owner of a 70-acre parcel near Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, a place I'd hunted with my dad as a kid, called and said, "You want to put a couple days in on the East Ridge?" "Sure. Just close the gate," I said yes, without thinking how small decisions can turn heavy. It was late archery season, November 2021, the kind of cold where your breath fogs and the snow is too light to hold footprints for long. It dusted everything in a hush. I drove up the long, rutted lane, pulled open a rusted gate that complained in protest, and hung the sign the owner gave me on the post. "Permission granted until sundown. Respect the land." The stand I wanted was a 30-yard walk into a little bowl above a creek, perfect for a morning sit. The landowner made it clear, "If anything looks off, you come out. Don't worry about making a fuss." I didn't worry because, for me, hunting was muscle memory. I worked the tree stand like it was part of my body. I climbed up around 5:30 a.m., daylight still bruised. The bow felt right in my hand. I could see the ridge opposite, a patchwork of white-tipped pines and a rusted farm roof down the hollow. Around 8 a.m., a doe came through the lower switchback, and I dropped her where she stood. It was clean, old school. I gutted and quartered on the spot, stacked the meat behind the stand, and shouldered what I needed to carry back to the truck. The owner's rules were simple. Take what you need and don't leave a mess. Walking back, I noticed something that didn't add up. About 50 yards before the stand, there was a ladder stand nailed into a tree that hadn't been there the week before. I would have seen it on my last trip. It was lower than the usual ones, almost a deer stand you step into more than climb, and there were fresh nail marks around the bark. And there was a single line of footprints in the dusting of snow leading up from the gate toward that caused chill in my neck. One track only, like someone had come from the road straight to the stand and then walked away on soft snow that, inexplicably, kept the prints only for a short distance. It didn't make sense. "Permission," I heard a voice say behind me, almost conversational. I turned, expecting the landowner, or maybe one of the neighbors, checking in. Instead, there was a man standing in the edge of a thicket, about 100 yards away on a slight rise. He was wearing a dirty grey hoodie, a few days' growth of beard that made his face look patchy, and he looked pale under the tree shadows. He waved. The wave was casual, like passing a neighbor at the mailbox. "Do you have permission?" I called back. He raised his hand in a half wave, and then, this is the part that lodged in my head, he walked toward a small clearing, made a slow motion like someone writing in the air, and then he was just gone. No additional footprints, no disturbance in the snow, nothing but the bare line of those first prints heading up the ridge to that new ladder stand. He had been standing there a heartbeat. I could still see where he stood, but there was no track. I remember thinking, at the time, okay, weird. People hike, people wander. Maybe he took a different route back to the road. Maybe his tracks were over a root or under a branch. Maybe I was overthinking it. I loaded the deer into the truck, the tailgate making that familiar metallic bang, and drove the mile back to the gate. That's when things turned from odd to wrong. My backpack, my old green pack with the fraying strap, the one with my father's initials scrawled on the inside, was laid out in the snow beside the truck like someone had taken inventory. My binoculars, my thermos, a roll of duct tape I always carry, the little pocket knife my dad gave me when I turned 16. Everything set out like items on a haphazard list. The paperwork in the glove box was flipped open. The map from the owner was lying on the passenger seat, face down, the route I'd used to come in, marked with a pen. I felt like someone had walked through my life and set out what mattered in front of me so they'd know what they'd taken or what they could take. And then he was there again, right at the edge of the tree line, maybe 20 yards away, standing in a half light that made his hoodie a flat grey. He didn't run. He didn't try to hide. He stood and looked straight at me, the way someone looks at a small animal. In his hand glinted something metallic when he raised it, a screwdriver, simple, dull, the sort of tool you'd use to pry open a box or make quick repairs. He didn't brandish it like a threat. He held it loosely, like an extension of his hand. He pointed at me slowly and then, with deliberate, absurd theatrics, dragged his finger across his throat. I don't remember the exact sequence of my own motions. I do remember my heart doing that ridiculous animal thing where you can hear it as if someone else is pounding a drum under your shirt. I locked the doors, slammed the keys into the ignition like it would make that hollow feeling disappear, and drove off without looking back. I called the property owner from the safety of the highway and then called the sheriff when I could find a patch of signal. They came out later that afternoon. The deputy who met me at the gate was quiet, took notes, asked the routine questions. He looked at the single line of footprints and the new ladder stand and made a face like he'd seen stranger things before. He told me to leave the scene untouched to the degree possible and that they'd circle the place when it got darker and cooler and they'd have a better shot at tracks. A week later, the property owner called me. They found a shelter, he said. A makeshift lean-to down by the creek, a tarp, a couple tarps nailed up between trees, a fire pit with coals still warm enough to show it had been used recently. They found some of your gear. The deputy had turned up a handful of things, an old pair of gloves I swear belonged in my truck, a spare flashlight, and the pocket knife. He also said the sheriff found animal bones, not deer legs or anything fresh like you'd expect from a predator's scatter, but miscellaneous small bones that looked like they'd been collected and kept. Clothes, old food cans, and stitching through the stand area, orange hunting vest strips tied to branches in deliberate patterns. Thin strips tied like flags, like markers you put up to warn someone away or to mark a path. They said some small animals were hung on sticks, the owner told me, voice tight over the phone, like offerings or warnings, squirrel, rabbit, a crow, hung up with wire through the legs. I didn't need him to describe it to know the picture. The deputy had also reported a makeshift bed with old blankets laid out and a little pile of items arranged as if catalogued. There was no sign of the man from the clearing, no ID, no footprints from where he'd supposedly vanished. After that, I stopped going back to that ridge. I stopped hunting that property alone. The things you don't expect in the woods aren't always animal. Sometimes they're people who have decided that the quiet belongs to them in a way you don't, and they mark it like a territory. The county never located the guy they called unknown in reports. Some nights, I'd lie awake thinking about those orange strips tied to branches, half understanding the ritual behind them the way you understand the steps to a dance you never wanted to learn. There's a humility that comes when whatever you assumed about the woods gets stripped away. If you thought that was bad, wait until you hear the next one. The trip to Crockett, Texas, started as something softer. My grandfather had a small house out there, the kind of place that smells like old wood and smoke even when you first open the door. He'd hunted those ranges for 40 years. The house was tucked back from a gravel road, surrounded by mesquite and live oak, the kind of property where you leave the porch light on at night because coyotes will come sing at the yard. We went down for the weekend because it was what you did with your grandpa. You sat on the porch, you listened to his stories about the good bucks he used to miss on purpose, and you brought him venison if you could. We drove in on a Friday afternoon, the sun low and gold, and parked under the old oak that had a rope swing. There was a lane cut through the trees that led to a small blind about 1.5 miles away. Grandpa liked that blind because you could see the creek where deer came to bed in the afternoon. He fixed a supper, beans and cornbread warmed on coals, and we talked about nothing and everything until it was time to get some sleep for the morning. But when I checked the blind the next day, I saw movement at the far edge of the tree line. Someone was crouched low, peering through the limbs at our blind, like they were watching a house with binoculars. From a distance, it looked like a dark dot. Then they leaned forward and put their face against a small opening between trees. I waved because sometimes it's a neighbor, sometimes it's a kid on an ATV being stupid. The person moved, then vanished into the brush. Grandpa didn't say anything. He just tightened his jaw, the way people do when they're cataloging details for later. We had a good morning. Grandpa took a doe at around 9 a.m., a clean shot. We quartered it, stacked the meat, and then he insisted we drive into town for supplies. Ice for the cooler, a jug of gas, some canned coffee. We left it all under the tarp by the blind, the same tarp we've always used, folded and tied. 20 minutes tops, Grandpa said. He winked at me like he trusted the place without thinking about the same world we all live in where someone watches, where the distance between you and the road is a line on the map, not an invisible wall. We were gone maybe 30 minutes. When we came back, my chest dropped before I saw the deer. The quarters were torn, the backstrap cut away and missing, the hide slashed in places that didn't look like a coyote. There were bite marks and claw impressions, but arranged in ways that confused us. Whoever or whatever had been at the deer had done more than strip meat. The cuts were deliberate in places that suggested someone had been searching for something, like a fiddler looking for a certain string. I remember dragging a hand over my face and feeling the grit of dust from the lane. That night we tried to calm ourselves. Grandpa said we'd watch a little, make sure nothing else came back. Around midnight I heard a yelp that didn't sit right in the bones. It started distant, a high keening that climbed and descended in ways coyotes don't usually arrange. It wasn't the 3-note yip of a coyote, it had more of a human cadence in the bend of the vowels. I told myself it was an injured animal. I told myself not everything has to be a story. Still, when I eased out of the house to check, the air had a charge. We took the rifles, Grandpa's old lever action and my AR, mostly to make a show of being armed. We tried to be logical. If it was a coyote, we could put it down. If it was an injured dog, we'd be humane. If it was nothing, we could laugh about it the next morning. We walked into the dark with the beam of a headlamp cutting a cone through the brush. There was a rustle ahead, a soft shape moving near the fence line. I said, "There, right there." Grandpa nodded, took aim and fired once. The animal broke and crashed in undergrowth, and for a second there was that awful small scent of hair, singed by a hot barrel. It was a coyote, small and mottled. We found it a few yards away later. It had been shot clean. We started to head back when the screams began. I can't explain the sound. It didn't fit what I'd been taught to recognize. It wasn't long bloody howls nor the weird yelping of a dog. It was something layered, a high, human-sounding keening wrapped in an animal's throat. It rolled across the fence and then came again, as if tracing the edges of our property. At first it was distant, then it got closer, and then it walked the perimeter of the house like a man pacing a porch. There were heavy footfalls, thumps against the siding, a sort of dragging that made the boards vibrate. Someone or something pressed against the door. Grandpa stood there and fired 2 warning shots through the door, and the pounded stopped, as if it had been listening. When a deputy finally came, and he came that night because neighbors had called when they heard shots, he stood on the porch and simply said, "I've been around a long time. I don't know what to make of what I heard." We packed up the next morning. Grandpa never went back to that blind. He wouldn't talk about it much, but sometimes he'd mutter about things that make noises like people but ain't people. The way old men talk about storms they can't explain without turning their boats away. The deputy wrote something down, filed it, and we were left with one unanswered truth. Not all screams you hear in the dark belong to animals, and not all footsteps in the night belong to people you can find. By then it was late, and the sky had that washed-out violet that means dawn is thinking about showing up. We loaded the truck quicker than usual, my stomach tight with the same mixture of frenzy and relief I'd felt at the truck in Wellsboro. I told myself this was an accident, some drifter, some sick prank, but a small knot of something like guilt latched onto me on the drive home. The idea that whatever screamed might have been hurt, might have been a person in trouble, and we waved it off because we were afraid. That image lodged, and it didn't leave me. Sometimes it turns into dreams that smell of cornbread and gun smoke. I had a brief sense as we pulled away from the ditch by the porch that the land watched us, not in a sentimental way, in a way that catalogued comings and goings, in a ledger of who disturbed what and when. That feeling stayed with me even before we reached the county line, and it accompanied a little gnawing worry that there are things in the wild that don't fit the boxes we keep in our heads. We didn't go back. Grandpa kept the porch light on for longer that fall, and we both pretended to be philosophical over dinner, but when it came down to it, the spot felt wrong. It had shifted from being a place of comfort into something keyed to caution. We were visitors to a place that had made a note of us, and we weren't invited back. The thing about places like that is, they teach you a new vocabulary of suspicion. You start to wonder about silhouettes at the edge of a tree line, about the way animals behave before people show up, about how sound in the dark can be rearranged into something that sounds like a call for help or a threat. It becomes hard not to translate every unusual noise into danger. I should have stopped there. I should have leaned into the discomfort and sworn off single-man sits forever. But the third time, the one with Kyle and Connor up in the mountains, that reluctance got tested in a way I couldn't have predicted. We were three guys with different levels of willingness. Me, still carrying the residue of Wellsboro and Crockett in my head. Connor, eager but a little skittish. And Kyle, who'd been hunting since he could walk and made the rest of us look amateur. We packed into an old pickup, the kind that smells like old leather and spilled coffee, and we shoved in a couple of sleeping bags, a thermos, a half-empty bottle of whiskey because that's what guys do on mountain trips, and food that didn't require a chef. The hike in wasn't much, a few miles, a small ridge to cross, then a clearing where we could set up 2 tents and a fire ring. We joked and shoveled the snow into piles, the air brisk, lungs hot when you laughed. Kyle teased us about who would flinch first. Connor said, "Probably me," and then bragged about being less skittish. We ate, we drank, we talked about nothing important, and that's how it started. Ordinary, human. That first night, around 11:30 p.m., we heard a scream in the distance. It was a single, thin sound that carried across the valley and made the hairs on my forearm stand up. We all stopped talking and listened. The fire popped like it was trying to answer. We told ourselves it was one of those mountain foxes or a bobcat. We kept our hands on our drinks to look casual. The second night, the scream came again, closer and longer. It wasn't relentless like an animal in pain. It had an intentionality to it, like someone testing boundaries. By the second night, the screams were different. They circled us. At first we heard them out in the ridgeline, then somewhere inside the tree line that closed in around our camp. There were scrapes on the tent fabric, not rips, but the way something heavy might press and drag, testing seams. Once, something walked around the tent and stopped right on the other side. We heard the sound of nails or claws on the ground. We heard a breath that wasn't wind. We snapped the rope tensioners tight and huddled. Kyle laughed, but it was a small laugh, the kind you hear when someone is telling the bones to be brave. On the third night, it wasn't outside the tents that we found it. It was in the middle of the campsite. We were sitting low, cramped into one tent because none of us wanted to be alone, when a scream cut through the night so close it felt like it exploded in our ears. It was a high keening that stopped us cold. Then there were thumps against the tent, the canvas vibrating with something's weight, the rustle of fabric and the sound of something pressing its face against the nylon. A scream so near, it felt like someone had shoved a mirror of noise into our chest. Connor swore and fired a shot into the air. Kyle cursed and started pounding metal pots. I can't say what any of us expected to accomplish. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was a person, maybe it was both. Whatever it was, whatever walked away, left us raw with that animal surge that says run now. Dawn didn't come soon enough. When it did, the light was thin and grey, and the campsite looked like we had left a story to cool by the fire. There were prints we couldn't place, long strides that didn't match the gait of a deer, elongated toes, if that makes any sense, and scrape marks in the soft ground that curved like they had been dragging something. The tents had scrapes, and at one corner of my sleeping bag there was a smear of something dark that could have been blood or pine sap. We never tested it. We packed in a blur and didn't talk about it much on the long drive back. The guilt stuck to me like the pine pitch on my fingers, the idea that maybe someone was in a lot worse shape than we'd thought, and we were too afraid to investigate, or maybe we were lucky to get away. Later, that lost scream turned into a dream. A woman, screaming and covered in something that might have been blood or mud, standing at the edge of a tree line and looking at me as if to ask why I'd left. I woke with my fists clenched around the memory of that sound and the knotted realization that there was no tidy answer. We had no truck full of evidence. We had no arrests. We had 3 guys who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place and the wrong hour. Either way, we came home different. When you string those 3 stories together, the stand on the ridge with the man and the orange ribbons, the Texas night with a thing that screamed like a person but moved like an animal, the mountains with pounding on a tent and a scream right in the middle of camp, a common thread emerges. The outdoors is not only wild because of trees and animals. It's wild because it can hold other people and unknown things, and those things can break into the ceremony of a hunt and leave you with questions that rotate in your skull at the quietest moments. I could stop here and end this on some neat moral. Always bring a buddy, always tell someone where you are, always carry a radio. Those are good practical things, but the truth is murkier. Even with all the precautions in the world, sometimes you get watched. Sometimes someone leaves a ladder stand where none belonged. Sometimes you hear a scream that fits no animal and no person neatly. And sometimes even after deputies comb the area and folks pick up the obvious traces, the rest stays unexplained. There are still parts of each story that I don't tell lightly. Details that sit like glass under the tongue and make me think twice before I strap my pack again. But there are other pieces I haven't shared. Things that tie into what the deputies found after my report in Pennsylvania, strange items found around the camp in Texas, and the way Kyle's face looked when he first heard the scream in the mountains and chose a bad joke over a question. Those are for later. For now, know this. The woods can be straightforward. They can also be ambiguous and dangerous in ways that don't fit what you trained for. You learn to read the obvious signs, tracks, scrapes, broken brush, but you keep learning the hard lessons about the less obvious ones, the human ones, and the unexplained ones, and you carry the memory like a hard coin in your pocket. I'll keep going, because there are more pieces to each of these stories. There are things deputies wrote down that I didn't want to repeat out loud the first time, and there are moments of reflection where I still ask myself whether I could have done something differently, whether we were owed answers that never came. Those parts matter. They change how you look at a ladder stand, at a distant figure in a hoodie. They change how you handle permission slips, how you approach your truck at sundown, how you sleep in a tent when the sound outside doesn't make sense. But first, let's go back to Wellsboro and the shelter they found. The deputy had a list of items recovered: a dented thermos, a flashlight similar to mine, a pocket knife I recognized, and a tarp folded into a bed. They reported small bones arranged like someone kept a collection. They found 3 orange strips tied to branches in a pattern that made no sense to anyone who hadn't been there. The shelter's fire pit had been tended recently. Whoever had been living under a tarp had been there long enough to organize things and then leave when the weather was warm for a day. They'd taken things from the trucks that were left on the property. They'd come and gone with the casualness of someone who thought the hunting season belonged to them. When the officer ran my pocket knife serial, I braced for the answer that would make everything simple. Stolen, found, returned. He came back shaking his head. "No prints, no ID," he said. "We didn't match it to anything in our system." In the margins of the report, someone had written, "Unknown transient suspected but not confirmed." Unknown, unexplained. Words that ought to be placeholders for investigation and closure, but instead become shrugs you learn to live with. I kept the pocket knife for a while, then mailed it back to the property owner with a note saying I didn't want it. He called me later and told me he found more than just my gear. He'd found old photographs shoved into a book, Polaroids of places that might have been other properties, other stands, pictures of people I didn't recognize. There were more orange strips lined against a sapling like a spine. He told me there was a plywood platform someone had bolted to a tree and then left. A perfect little sleeping nook with a pile of empty cans and a quilt that was fraying at the edges. He wasn't camping like a normal person, he said. He left things out like a list. When I told my dad about it, he looked at me the way he always does when he thinks I haven't thought something through. "You go in the woods," he said, "and you expect to be accountable for what you do. Some folks expect the same of you." He paused. Then he said softly, "You could have asked for trouble, sure. Or you could have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Doesn't make you weak to turn around." So I turned around, not because I was ashamed, but because something had shifted in me that didn't want to test the edges of it again. I still hunt, but I changed how. I don't sit alone in the late season. I check in more. I treat every unfamiliar sign as a little alarm. That doesn't always feel like bravery. Sometimes it feels like being smaller and safer. But it also feels like the practical thing to do when a man in a grey hoodie knows how to draw a throat across his hand as if to write the end of a sentence. In Texas, the deputy's report added a detail I hadn't been privy to that night. Neighbors had said they'd seen a figure at the edge of the lane 2 nights running, and somebody had reported a parked pickup with a busted tail light. The deputy ran plates on the truck descriptions, found nothing solid, and noted peculiar scratch marks on the house exterior where something had been pounding, not simply pressing. A slamming that matched the rhythm of a man who had been trying to get in. The coyote we shot turned out to be a plain coyote, no sign of human interaction beyond the wound. But the way the thing had screamed, neighbors said later, matched nothing they'd heard in the hills. "Like a human on a hill at full throat," one neighbor told the deputy. There were questions and there were no answers. That pattern repeats, and I think that's partly why these stories get under the skin so deep. The not knowing refuses to be satisfied. You start to imagine motives as if filling in the blanks will give you control. But imagining is a poor substitute for facts, so I keep saying unknown. I keep saying unexplained. Kyle texted me once, months after that mountain trip. He sent a photo of his boots lined up in his garage, the laces knotted like prayer ribbons. He wrote, "Still can't hear that scream without feeling my hands go cold." Connor stopped going on trips for a while. He said he preferred hunting squeezed into a group, in the safety of people who would wake at a whisper and chain themselves together. Me, I began carrying a handheld radio and a bigger flashlight. I made a stupid decision once to stay when the others wanted to leave, and it taught me humility. Stupid decisions carve grooves in you don't always see. There are more files the deputies wrote that are dry and clinical and then folded into evidence boxes. There are reports we never saw. There are stories neighbors told about a man with a screwdriver who hung orange strips and took things that weren't his. Everything that surfaces feels like an edge. Everything that doesn't remains a bruise. I'm going to keep telling the rest of these details because they matter. The string of actions, the wave, the disappearance without footprints, the organized laying out of items, the finger across the throat, reads like a code. I don't pretend to crack it. I only want you to see it as I saw it, a sequence that made sense to someone and not to me. And if you like to hunt, if you go out because of the quiet and the work and the way the woods teach you history by scent and track, then be aware of this kind of quiet too, the human kind. There's more to tell. There are traces the sheriff's office found on the property and reports the deputy filed in Crockett that don't make it into headlines. The third story has a part I haven't even mentioned yet. The strange thing Kyle found the morning after that scream. It looks mundane at first, then it unspools into something else, but I won't rush through it. These moments need room. They ran my knife and a few other items through evidence, then closed the folder with a note that said unknown, where they'd hoped for a name. That little word, unknown, became the refrain in my head. It sat on the report like a period that never finished the sentence. The deputy told me later, off the record, that they tried trail cameras on the property for a while, left baits and logs and motion sensors, but the cameras either recorded nothing or only the sway of a sapling in wind. Sometimes the things that haunt you are careful enough to leave the appearance of nothing at all. The landowner found more after we stopped going up there. He called one night and told me he'd pulled up an old plywood platform bolted to a maple on the lower ridge, a new ladder stand someone had scraped together and then abandoned mid-season. He found Polaroids stuffed into a book and wedged into a seam of a tarp, photos of other clearings, other stands, people in half-shadow. He couldn't make heads or tails of them, and neither could we. He sent me one picture, no names, no dates, just a grainy shot of a man in a grey hoodie, head tilted, standing in front of a tree with orange strips tied around it. I looked at it until the picture blurred. The man could have been anyone. He could have been connected to any of us. He could also have been unrelated, a coincidence folded into fog. The sheriff marked it unexplained in his notes. There are small things that link these stories together, not in the way that proves anything, but in the way that makes your spine prick. A screwdriver glinting in a hand, orange ribbon tied like a marker, animal bones collected and arranged, Polaroids stuffed into a tarp, no direct proof that any one person did all of it, but patterns enough to make your chest tighten. We wanted taxonomy, something to catalog and lock away. Instead we had pattern recognition run wild and a list of loose ends. Kyle's photograph from the mountain trip became one of those loose ends. The morning after the scream, he'd left the tents zipped while the three of us sat in the truck, the heat on full and not wanting to step back out into that thin, cold grey. Kyle went to check the perimeter while Connor and I argued over coffee and whose idea it had been to bring a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He came back holding something in his gloved hand, white snow clinging to the edges, and he didn't smile. "What is it?" Connor asked. Kyle didn't answer right away. He held the thing out, a crinkled Polaroid, the colors washed with frost. On it was the shadow of a person in a hood, standing in what looked like a clearing. At first, I didn't see the face. I saw the way the person had turned his shoulders, an odd tilt, and then I saw a hand half raised in a wave. The sleeve had an orange strip tied to it, a thin ribbon like the ones the deputy found on the PA property. "That could be anything," I said. But the Polaroid made a soft sound inside my chest, the way old metal box lids do. It matched something I'd seen in my head, the man on the ridge. The problem was the same. Resemblance isn't identity. The Polaroid had no writing on the back, no timestamps, nothing that connected it. Kyle swore he found it a few yards from the tent line, shoved under a shrub where it had been mashed into the mud and frozen. There were long drag marks in the snow nearby that didn't match deer or bear. They were offset, as if something had been carried. We passed that picture around between us like a card you don't want to be left holding. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was meaningful, maybe both. We never learned what camera took it or where the picture had first been put. It only deepened the not knowing. The deputy in Crockett filed his report with the same empty margins. He wrote down our stories and the neighbor accounts of a truck with a busted tail light. He wrote unidentified vehicle as a line item and circled it twice. He wrote that the pounding on the house sounded deliberate, like a person trying to get in, and yet there were elements, an animal-like keening, that didn't fit the standard animal behavior we'd trained ourselves to understand. The official language reads like a person trying to be sober in the face of weirdness, unexplained vocalization, possible human presence, no positive ID. He closed his case without arrests. He told me, when he called back to say the report was complete, that the thing that bothered him most wasn't the scream itself, but how plainly it sat between the categories we use to make sense, human and animal, without belonging to either. Those categories are what we take into the woods with us. Tracks mean animal, voice means human, boot prints mean neighbor. When things don't fit the chart, your training can be useless. It doesn't teach you how to read a throat-shaped gesture made at your truck, or how to interpret a scream that imitates the human range, but arrives with the cadence of something else. Those are the moments that reteach you to be small and watchful. After the mountain trip, I found myself fitting mundane acts with new weights. I checked the zippers on my gear twice before bed. I retied my tent knots a certain way. I left the lantern burning longer. Those were small, prosaic changes, safety by habit, but they seemed to hollow out an old confidence. Connor wouldn't answer calls for months. Kyle started sleeping in a different room than his girlfriend when he was home. Me, I had the Polaroid laminated and kept it folded into a wallet I didn't use. It became a talisman and an indictment at once, a reminder that something had been there, and we had fled. Guilt did its own work. After the screams in the mountains, I kept running through the what-ifs like they were emergency drills I had failed to complete. What if we'd walked toward the sound? What if the scream had been a person needing help? What if staying together in a tent was the most we could do? Those questions don't come with answers. The only thing they give you is appetite. The more you chew them over, the more of them you find. Sometimes the mind's appetite is worse than the danger it tries to avoid. None of these stories ended with a clear perpetrator or a neat explanation. The Wellsboro shelter produced items and no suspect. Crockett had a shaken deputy and a missing backstrap. The mountain had prints that didn't match and a Polaroid with no origin. They all share that relief and hunger pattern, relief that you were able to get away, hunger for something that would explain why the world made that noise at that moment. I talked to people after all of this, hunters I respect, old men with hands like roots, and women with quiet, practical wisdom. Most said the same things you already know. Go with a partner when you can. Let someone know where you're going. Carry a radio. Be visible. Be smart. Those are good rules. They are the rules that keep you out of bad paperwork and reduce the number of nights you pack a bag in panic. But rules only get you so far when the unsettlement is not about equipment or legalities, but about the sense that the place itself watched and took note. I don't tell these stories to scare you off the woods. I'd be hypocritical if I did. The outdoors saved me in other ways, gave me a skill set, a calm, a way of measuring days by weather and wind. But the point of relaying them honestly is this. There are threats beyond the ones we are trained to face. There are people who move through the woods with intentions that are unclear, and there are sounds that mimic people closely enough to trick you. Knowing both facts doesn't give you control, but it gives you context. It moves instinct into preparation. Some months later, I found myself at a bench by the river, looking at the water move its slow, terrible way. I thought about how these stories had changed me in small, stubborn increments, how I flinched at the sound of a hood pulled up, how I learned to prefer daylight packouts, how I started telling a friend where I was going every time I left the house. Those are small things. They are practical things. They are also confession. I learned to be more scared so that I could stay alive. If there is a through line to this collection, it isn't that the woods are hostile by default. It's that the woods contain everything we are: animals, people, sadness, ritual, cruelty, kindness. And sometimes those things show up in combinations that confuse our categories. That confusion is what left us shaken. That confusion is what let a man wave and disappear, and another leave a tarp with bones and a set of Polaroids. It is why a deputy can write unexplained vocalization and mean exactly what he writes. We heard it, we recorded it, we did not solve it. So here's what I do now. I hunt with someone I trust. I tell a neighbor when I'm going out. I leave my truck key in a place a partner can find it. I carry a handheld radio because it creates a paper trail while also letting you call for help. I avoid stands I don't recognize, and I don't dismiss the feeling that comes with a misplaced orange ribbon. Those are not guarantees. They are small protections, and they buy time and margin. The last thing I want to say is this, and it's the most honest part. Sometimes there is no tidy ending. Sometimes the sheriff's office writes unknown, and the deputy sighs, and the landowner keeps the Polaroids in a drawer, and you sleep with the radio on. You learn to live with the not knowing. You learn to treat it with respect, rather than letting it become a story that proves your toughness. These events changed how we moved through the woods, how we trusted strangers with hoodies under trees, how we regarded the night. If any of this resonates with you, if you've been on the receiving end of a look that didn't belong, a sound that shouldn't be possible, or the hollow feeling of returning to your truck and finding it rearranged, leave a comment below. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it changed you. I read every one of them. I don't claim to have answers. I only collect and pass them on because the more we know, the more we can watch for pattern and protect one another. If you want more of these true accounts, if you want me to keep collecting stories from other hunters, campers, and people who go into the woods and come back with a new vocabulary, subscribe and hit the bell. Share this with someone you hunt with. Maybe it starts a conversation that keeps one person safer. Be careful out there. Be smart. Bring a buddy when you can. And if you hear a scream that sounds like a person but doesn't quite line up with what you know, it's okay to leave and call for help. Some things in the wild are explainable, some remain unknown. We live with both, and that's part of the hard lesson of these 3 stories.